I decided that I wanted to be a pastor when I was 9 years old. I very much had the Christian experience of feeling called to be a pastor. I most of the time would describe myself as an atheist at this point.
What made you decide to go off on your own?
I didn't know it at the time, but I had significant anxiety disorder and undiagnosed ADHD. I canceled a family vacation because I was so anxious I couldn't leave town. I had the worst birthday ever, and I finally realized that I am not well and I needed help. And so just took myself to urgent care.
Thank you for sharing, because I know what you're sharing is going to resonate with a ton of people, because it's absolutely resonating with me.
Within 2 weeks, I was like, I need to start a business. It's Blazer Strategies. This is what it's going to be. And I've just been off to the races since.
If you had to choose between happiness or success, which would you choose?
I'm a much better dad and husband when I'm happy in my career. I'm going to pick being a good dad and good husband every time.
Welcome back, Wayfinders. I'm Vanessa Juppy, host of 101 Ways Out. Before we dive into today's episode, I want to give you a quick heads up. I sat down with Keith Davenport last June, and since then, his life has evolved in some pretty big ways. During our conversation, you're going to hear him talk about his upbringing and his origin story. He was raised in a conservative family in a small town with a strict religious upbringing before he moved away and broadened his worldview. Keith has always been values-led, which enabled him to open his heart and his mind. You'll hear about his HR tech startup and his upcoming political campaigns. But true to his serial entrepreneur roots, he's since made some major pivots to stay aligned with his family and his values. I'm going to give you an exact breakdown of what he's up to today at the end of the episode, so stick around. But for now, we're going to jump into his incredible and awe-inspiring journey.
So let's start with this. Why don't you introduce yourself and tell us where you are now and what's going on in your life right now, and then we'll go backwards through what your journey has been like.
So I'm Keith Davenport. I live in Gardner, Kansas, and that's a really important part of my life right now. I am in the very young stage of being a serial entrepreneur. So right now I have 3 businesses that I'm working on. Coffee shop, which is where I'm recording right now, Groundhouse Coffee. I have a business consulting firm, Blazer Strategies, and then a brand new startup in HR tech called Mythic Hire. I have 4 kids, and Gardner has just become our home. So we've lived here for 10 years, and we've been trying to buy a house. Serial entrepreneur, love Gardner, dad and husband.
I love it. Awesome. House journey. Along with so many of your other journeys, I feel like I see so much more content from you now than I used to. And I've been following along a little on your house journey too, because you also had a political campaign that you put the brakes on. And so it feels like you're very open with the ups and downs of what's going on in your life. Have you always done that, or is that something new?
That's an interesting question. And it's also really interesting right now because my wife is the exact opposite. Like if she could live completely privately where nobody knew anything about us, that would be her preference. And so my foray into the political realm has definitely come with some new space. I think in general, I've always been a little bit that way. Even in high school, I started a blog and was blogging at that point. In college, I had an email newsletter I was putting out. Right after college, I started another blog that I kept updated for 5 or 10 years. So there's always been a little bit about that. It's been less about my personal journey through most of it and more complex things in different ways. And so I don't know if it's still on trend at all, but I tend to write a lot rather than a little. I use ChatGPT for a lot of things, but not my writing. It's always been a part of me. And I'm sure we're going to get into the story of my history, but for a while I was a pastor. So you can kind of start seeing some components like stream through that, but a little bit different levels of privacy, but always been very much thinking out loud in front of people type person.
That's awesome. And the blog in high school, that's cool. I don't think I've ever met somebody that's done a blog in high school. It feels early.
It was Zynga. So like it was like very popular, just following MySpace. And so I had a Zynga for a while. I haven't talked about that in a really long time. So it's bringing back all these like high school drama memories, really. So
Yes.
yeah. And then I had a blog for at least 5 years, maybe 8 or 10, called Listening Inside Out. Talked a lot about life and faith and all kinds of different things. I think my last project on that blog was only about 8 years ago, I guess. It was right in the midst of Ferguson and the first national eyes on the Black Lives Matter movement. And so I got together with a friend of mine and we talked about race. And so we had a project about that. He's a Black American. And so it's kind of a little bit of my own introduction and journey into that racial conversation, but that was the last project I did on there. I kind of disappeared for a little bit and then have come back in the last 3 years or so.
That's a really interesting project. It must have been such a cool way to learn as well.
It was. And I think now if I went back and read it, I've come so far from what I said back then that even what I said back then, I probably don't even agree with, or like I was really a baby working in that space at the time. So it was an important part of like my stepping stones.
It is interesting how throughout our lives, if we allow ourselves, how we're constantly evolving and growing.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I would love to go back in time and start with baby Keith, young Keith. Like, what was your childhood like? What was your upbringing like? Because I feel there are going to be patterns that kind of fit together that allow people to kind of follow a different path. So I'm really curious about what shaped you.
I'm the oldest of 4 kids. We're all about 2 years apart. The first really formative greatest milestone. So when I was born, and for the first 6 or so, 5 years of my life, lived with my mom and dad. I'm from Illinois, grew up all the way in Illinois. My dad was a pastor. And then at some point near when I was 5 or 6, he changed his belief system, stopped being a pastor, turned atheist. And kind of in that process, he also made some other choices. And eventually my parents divorced. So from the time I was 7 on, I was raised by my mom, still connected with my dad to some extent. She was a elementary school teacher. Eventually my grandma, her mom, moved in with us because she helped take care of the house, meals, and us kids. My mom would always have to go to school earlier before the 4 of us kids could go. And so it was a small rural town called Polo, Illinois. Our high school mascot were the Marcos. We were the Polo Marcos. And we had a population about 2,500. My graduating class was 49. We didn't have a stoplight in town. And so now living in the Kansas City area, I couldn't be farther away from where I was growing up. But it was very much a conservative Christian household. There was room to the right of us of a lot more conservatism, but definitely grew up in that evangelical world. Eventually decided I wanted to be a pastor. So I went to college to be a pastor. Then I went to seminary, got an MDiv. But really going to college was the start of my movement away from conservatism and more towards much more progressive ideas, which really then eventually shaped career choices and so on.
Wow, there's so much that's so interesting there. Your dad being a pastor and then moving away from faith did not affect your desire at all. Maybe what made you still kind of resonate with that? Was it your mom or what was it?
So a little bit. I used to joke like I was literally in church the first Sunday after I was born. So to some extent, it was the only thing I knew. And any kind of movement away from that was definitely seen as wrong and immoral. And so that influence, that didn't change my faith in that regard. And then I think the fact that my dad's change in religion together with his change in behavior helped kind of solidify the fact that changing that faith was bad in my perspective at the time, right? So there was a lot of that. And really, I stayed pretty consistent down that path. I mean, all the way through grad school and beyond. So it's been about 11 years now since I was a pastor, fewer years since I've really shifted perspectives on that. Yeah, I just continue to go in that lifespan. I didn't know any different. I mean, just like anyone who grows up in any one concentrated idea group. I mean, that's all my friends were from church. All my extracurricular activities were in church, with very slight exceptions through school. And even my friends at school tended to go to other churches. And so there was just very much an insular community there. And the town was like 2,500 people. So it wasn't like there was tons of diversity around. Like everyone was a rural country person. Like looking back, I think there was one Black family in town, one Latino family, and one Jewish family. And everybody else in the whole town was white. So it really was an insulated growing up experience.
Yeah, absolutely. Gosh, that makes so much sense. And so you said your views started to shift when you got to college. Was there anything in particular that shaped your views, or was it just being exposed to different types of things?
I mean, I think we all just we're on this journey of always learning new things and being open-minded. And I think it's really normal when students go off to college and they start experiencing different parts of life, separated from their parents. They have to decide, sometimes for the first time, what they believe, if it's the same or different than what their parents do. So there's many ways that my story is not any different than anybody else's. I was a typical 18-year-old who went to college, and I had different experiences, and I found myself thinking and feeling differently than I did when I grew up, right? So there's some very normal component of that. But specifically for me, because my faith at that point was such a significant part of my life, and I was in a degree program to be a pastor, it actually was the learning about that. So at that time, I'm learning ancient Greek, ancient Hebrew, original context from which the Bible is written. And I actually was really, I don't want to take your podcast too far into like the theology realm here, but what blew me away was a lot of the things I learned about the Bible were actually different than how I learned them all growing up.
Oh, wow.
So immediately my experience shifted in that regard. I can give one example
Yeah, please.
that I think might be familiar for a lot of people. So a lot of folks are familiar with the creation story as Christians believe it, with this idea of 7 days creation. And there's been a lot of work to try and figure out how to reconcile the creation story with science and evolution and so on. One of the things I learned as a part of a history class was there was actually an ancient creation story. Like, so most empires or people groups had their own origin story, creation story in their mythology. And the ancient Babylonians had one called the Enuma Elish, and it was actually went through 7 days of creation. It had a little bit of a different, there was two gods that were fighting, and one of the gods made humans as slaves to fight the other god, and so on. And that predated the writing of Genesis. So to condense this, all of a sudden I realized that the creation story in Genesis 1 was actually a theological interpretation of this ancient Babylonian creation story, which immediately changes your perspective on it from this was never intended to be like a history or scientific account. This was ancient mythology in which this people group was trying to say something different than the Babylonians did in their creation story. And then you could pull out meaning in that in life. In Genesis, God creates humans in a positive light, not to be slaves and not to go to war. So then you have some theological meaning that comes out of that. But that's just one example of the more I learned about history being different than how I grew up, it just started to really shift the way that I was interpreting the world.
That's so interesting and very cool. Tell me about like what made you decide to be a pastor, then how did you move away from that?
So I decided that I wanted to be a pastor when I was 9 years old. Within the Christian tradition, there's a lot of belief around the idea of calling, which isn't necessarily specific to religion. There's a lot of other religions that have senses of calling, and there's atheistic understandings of calling to a vocation, right? I very much had the Christian experience of feeling called to be a pastor. I followed that track. I went undergrad, got a bachelor's degree in pastoral ministry from a Christian school, part of my denominational heritage. Then how I moved to Kansas City was to attend our denominational seminary, which is in Kansas City, Missouri. Got my Master of Divinity. Throughout my seminary time, I was a pastor in Kansas City, Kansas. While I was an undergrad, I was a youth pastor at a Korean church near Chicago. And afterwards, pastored in Kansas City, Kansas, and then in Lawrence until about 2014. The initial reason I moved away from pastoral ministry was the last place that I pastored. We had restarted this congregation. So when my family, we had moved from Kansas City to pastor this church in Lawrence, there was essentially just one person who was a part of the church on a regular basis. We were restarting this. The church didn't pay a salary, so I had to get a job outside. I spent most of that time in career-wise at Johnson County Community College in higher education. And I got that job because when I was in college, I had been involved in student clubs and organizations and student government. So it was a job in student development that fit that experience. Eventually, I was living in Eudora, which is about halfway between Lawrence and Overland Park, which is where the community college is. And I was working in Overland Park about 50 hours a week as a manager supervising 15 employees, but then would drive half hour home, and then I'd have to drive about another half hour to the church to do things there. And I essentially just burned out. I just couldn't continue in that space anymore. At about that time that we were getting ready to leave, the church just made the decision, instead of trying to restart, that congregation just dispersed. Another congregation bought the building. And then I just was going to dedicate my time in life in higher education at that point. There's more to the story that goes fast forward at 3 or 4 years, but that was kind of the first initial step outside of pastoral ministry. I was burned out in 2017. I thought about getting back into it, but I was reluctant or refused to go back to a position where I would have to work full time in addition to being a pastor, because I knew that I couldn't be a good dad and it couldn't be my best self doing that. And I couldn't find a spot. I moved into local government. I filed my credentials as a minister at that point, and just went on that career path in communications and local government from there.
Where are you now with your faith?
Most of the time would describe myself as an atheist at this point. And particularly though, I mean, I can get really into like the titles or putting a label on it, right? So there's the ists and the isms and all of that. So I am not a naturalist in that I don't think that everything about life can be measured by science. I think there's some spiritual realities, the way in which people interact with one another, sort of the flow of the universe in some way. But I don't necessarily attribute that to a deity. I really just attribute that to the fact of nature as part of the natural order, even though it's unable to be measured. So that's where I am now. A lot of the same values that I grew up learning and learned in college and seminary still drive my life. I mentioned at the top of the podcast how much I love Gardner. So I'm really just all of my entrepreneurial work has been specifically and intentionally in this town. My political work has been in this town, really trying to make the town a better place and better paying jobs, more opportunities. I advocate for public policies that match a lot of those, what I call values now, but would have called beliefs. And so I'm still very much shaped by that history and some of the values that really like sort of the more in-depth study in college about the Bible taught me than what typically is described when you're mixing church and politics now. Very much shaped me, but I'm very far away from it at the same time.
Yeah, that's so interesting because it's not that long. It's less than 10 years when you thought, oh, I'll generally go back to be a pastor versus now. So last question on that, and then we'll move away. But was there any like defining moment that made you change your mindset, or was it more gradual, and why?
It was definitely gradual, and I would say over maybe a 10-year period. However, there was 1 year of that was especially formative. So in 2022, I ran for State House of Representatives here in Kansas, Gardner. I ran as a Democrat. I had voted conservative my whole life. After Trump was elected in his first term, I didn't want to be connected with that. It just really went like his rhetoric and policies contradicted my values. And at that point, I still would have called them beliefs and like identified as a Christian. At first, I was like, okay, I'm done with the Republican Party for now. I had tried reaching out to my representatives, senator, congressman. I was just getting canned responses. I was so mad about it. And this was in the midst of like children being separated from their parents, and to get canned responses back from these folks that I grew up being taught to respect and to vote for and so on. I just couldn't, I had to disconnect. So I remember still filling out the form when I registered as a Democrat in 2018. Because of Kansas, you have to be registered with a political party in order to vote in primaries. So I decided I'm going to register as a Democrat so I can vote for moderate Democrats in primaries. That was my plan. Now I'm super progressive, and so it's really funny to think about. So had that kind of start. The fast forward to 2022, and I decided to run for office, and I was running as a Democrat in a very conservative district against a 5-term incumbent. And it was probably one of the first times that very outspoken and forward and public about the fact that I was a registered Democrat. Now, I still was doing all the things we talked about as far as blogging and talking about policy. At that point, I didn't have a blog anymore, but I was posting long posts on Facebook just about policy related to the Trump administration and reconciling faith and politics in this way. But this was the first time that really came out being a Democrat. And I remember one of the biggest things I was worried about running as a Democrat is that at that point, I still leaned very much pro-life. And my plan was just not to talk about it. And then Dobbs was overturned, and it became the central element of the entire campaign. This year was long, and there was a lot of formative things, but a few pieces that happened in that is at the point that I started running, I would have said, I'm not pro-life, but I am anti-abortion. I think at the beginning, I wanted women having the right to choose, and I just really wanted them to choose not to have an abortion, was kind of where I was at the beginning of that. And then right after Dobbs was overturned that week, I was out holding a sign saying I'm with her. And I was one of the only men in this group of women at this park protest. And that picture was like front of the newspaper. So me, who like 6 weeks earlier had wanted to not talk about abortion on the campaign trail because I knew it was a losing argument in this conservative area, and it would alienate Democrats based on my stance too at that point, front page newspaper. So one of the things that happened after that was I got an email from a random person who lived 2 states away telling me that I could not be a Christian and a Democrat.
Oh, wow.
And I just at that point replied, but I am. Literally, I am both a Christian and a Democrat. So clearly I can be. That kind of was pushing me in that direction. Right after COVID, we had come out of a lot of things. And so that was definitely a push that way. The more I dug into the abortion issue, the farther I leaned towards pro-choice, because I started learning more about the medical facts. I started learning about the science that the pro-life groups was claiming to be true. As I dug more into it, it just actually wasn't accurate. A great example of that is like heart starts beating at however many days. Well, if you really look in sort of the medical perspective of that, the heart's not formed at that point. It's just some electrical charges inside this group of cells. And so the more I dug into that, the more I felt like the pro-life conversation was misleading at best and deceptive, maybe at worst. And I realized that even people listening to this, there's probably a group of folks that's raging against the podcast right now. But this was my journey in the midst of this. So I started going farther and farther down that road. Started learning that the pro-life groups in Kansas had blocked medical access, like bills being passed for additional medical access. They held those bills hostage until Kansas would pass an abortion ban. And so it started getting like this. They went so far as the end justified the means. So they were willing to withhold medical access through expanding Medicaid to, I think the number at that point maybe was 120,000 Kansans, most of which were kids. I might be off on my numbers there. But like I started seeing that these other values just don't add up in the way they're practicing, and it's counterproductive. So that was a deep journey that moved that regard. When I wanted to become a pastor a few years earlier and couldn't, the idea of calling was really challenged. Like, if God wants me to be a pastor, but I literally can't find a job to be a pastor, how do these things connect? The last thing that happened, rather quite sad. So I lost the election. That's sad, but not the sad thing I'm going to tell you. 2 days later, I remember it was in the evening, the Thursday night after election day. Representative Sharice Davids had called me just to give me some encouragement after losing, hung up. And about an hour or an hour and a half later, we got a panicked call from my mother-in-law across town. My father-in-law had had a heart attack. Long story short, he passed that night with this massive heart attack, totally rocked us all. And I think it's true for a lot of folks when you experience a big sort of traumatic event or loss of someone, you really dig deep into what you believe about that. And I think that was among the things and the other things that I experienced that year that really set me to like the 97% that direction. And then the following spring, I kind of finished it off and really shifted from that.
Wow. Thank you so much for sharing all of that. And
yeah, super long story.
No, it's a great story. And honestly, I think it's amazingly helpful. And I've talked to several other people just through this kind of journey that faith played such a big role in their lives. And it's really interesting what it is that defines us and how we kind of go through this life, how things become different over time. I appreciate you sharing it. All that to say.
Yeah, it's been interesting to walk through it with peers, and some folks a little older, a little younger, and then kind of recognizing, oh, you're a little farther on this journey than I am, or I can see you're starting to come on this journey or whatnot. And then, I mean, the reality is my family, so I mentioned I was the oldest of 4 kids. 2 of my 3 siblings are pastors. My mom just retired from being a pastor. So after I went to college, she left elementary school and became a pastor too. And so she's been a pastor for decades. So my whole family still is in that place. And I think one of the biggest differences between Christianity and atheism is I don't feel like I have to sort of evangelize other people into atheism. I mean, I'm going to recognize if actions or beliefs are harmful or oppressive to other people, no matter where they come from. But that's not confined to one faith group. But I'm not trying to convince any of my siblings or friends or coworkers or employees to change what they believe to be more like me. I'm just still living my life and trying to follow out my values. And the way that I interact with folks is really indiscriminate upon what their belief system is. And I don't feel the need to change what they think.
You know that moment when you realize that you can't keep living the way that you've been living? You've probably heard several of my guests talk about that already. If that resonates with you and you're feeling like you're in that moment, you're in luck. I've created a 30-day program that's going to help you become unstuck, reconnect with your joy, reconnect with yourself, and reconnect with your values. We're going to work together to figure out your next step, your vision, and your path forward. This is an invitation for you to live the life of your dreams that truly lights you up. Visit 101waysout.com to get started.
I wish they could all be that way. What made you change the path that you're on, the path you're on that feels like what you're supposed to be doing to define life in a different way?
Yeah.
Maybe on your own terms.
It's so hard. I just feel like there's so many things that shape the way we interact with the world and attribute value to things in the world that shape that. A few things that kind of were like the apex of it, like the really crux of the matter, was when the pandemic hit in 2020. At that point, I was community relations manager, I think was my title, for Johnson County Mental Health Center. So what that looked like for me, I was part of county government. Obviously, we were providing mental health services. That was our clients. And we specifically were doing mental health services to the individuals with acute or persistent mental health concerns. And I was a part of the division that was in prevention and outreach. So there was also this responsibility for helping county population of 600,000 people deal with their mental health concerns or give attention to their mental well-being through this pandemic. So there was tons of education. So during that time, at least for 9 months, maybe longer, every morning of every day, the executive leadership team would meet to talk about what changes. We had 3 different locations in person. We were providing like suicide hotline, crisis hotline, acute care, ongoing care, work for individuals who are incarcerated, all these really critical things. So we were open and moving. So we had these 3 locations. So every morning, the executive leadership team would meet and they would talk through whatever new guidance had come out about health, what changes we need to make, and so on. They would send me this rough list of the notes from their meeting. I would have to condense that into an email that was consumable for our 350 employees, and then send it back and connect with all the subject matter expertise to make sure I had all the information correct, and then have that sent by the end of the day. And that was almost every day for months.
Wow.
After sort of the peak of the crisis came out, that's when the federal government, state government, and foundations really started providing significant grant money to help with the COVID response. And of course, as a mental health center, the mental health center in Johnson County is about 50% funded by fees for service and 50% funded by a mixture of tax dollars from various locations, local, state, and federal. So in order for us to increase services without increasing costs, grants are a significant way for us to do new initiatives. We kept adding new programs and things to these grants. And one part that I learned through that is that anytime you have a grant for a new program, there's always communications or marketing that has to go with it to make the program work. That doesn't tend to get written into the grant to fund additional labor hours to do it and so on. So there became a point where it was super stressful. It was hard to prioritize work, and I was getting burned out. Now, that was all happening very natural. Like anybody in that experience, been experiencing that stress. In addition to that, I didn't know it at the time, but I had significant anxiety disorder, undiagnosed ADHD, which was impacting the way I was interacting with my coworkers in the midst of this stress and critical moment, to the point where I had made a lot of people upset. Like I was the outsider in the group. And just an example of how this played out. So I felt like my plate was full, and I had coworkers who liked to do weekly or monthly lunches where we'd all go out as a division and go out to eat. And I hated them because I had so much work. I didn't want to spend an hour and a half sitting and talking to people because I needed work to do. And I've always separated work from friends. And so it was just really weird for me. But because of that, I looked like a real jerk, and it caused conflict. So all that to be said, in May of 21, I had actually gone back to school and finished an MPA during the pandemic. So in May of 21, I graduated. I went on vacation that summer. I was driving around Mesa, Arizona, and I had this realization of, I don't really like my job. It was like, my wife had been telling me that for 6 months, but I kept saying, no, I love my job. She goes, well, you always seem mad and stressed, but I love my job. And so on vacation, I realized I don't. And went back and started making some moves to try and move out of that. So ended up moving to the nonprofit space for a little bit, ran for office, and then jumped into the entrepreneurial world.
Wow. Oh my gosh. Isn't it so strange how sometimes our partners can see things that we just refuse to see?
Looking back at that time, I still can't believe this, but at one point, my wife invited my youngest sister to come visit from Colorado just because I was so unhappy. She was just trying to figure out how to make me happy. Looking back, like that was just seemed like nice at the time. She like surprised me with this visit from my sister. But now I like look back and like realize how weird that is. Like my husband is so sad and unhappy that I need to invite somebody from out of state to try and cheer him up. And really the final turning point for me to jump into entrepreneurship, a friend of mine started an executive coaching business and he wanted to use me as a free guinea pig. And so I said yes. And finally through some of that coaching, and then particularly difficult day one day, I took myself to urgent care and got on anti-anxiety med and started therapy. And within 2 weeks, I was like, I need to start a business. It's Blazer Strategies. This is what it's going to be. And I've just been off to the races since. And it was just
Oh my God.
to address that mental health concern. There was a point earlier that year, I canceled a family vacation because I was so anxious. I couldn't I couldn't leave town. But
Yes.
that wasn't a warning sign for me yet. I don't know. It was my birthday that year. I loved my birthday. I had the worst birthday ever. And I finally realized that I am not well and I needed help. And so I just took myself to urgent care. And that was the start of a 2-year journey now of really doing a lot of work on myself.
Oh my God, Keith, I am, first of all, so happy for you and proud of you that you came to that realization. And also thank you for sharing, because I know what you're sharing is going to resonate with a ton of people, because it's absolutely resonating with me. And I've talked to so many other people that have gotten into situations like that. And I feel like most people just don't know how to advocate for themselves. How long have you struggled with anxiety?
I just was talking with my wife about that this week because I was trying to figure out if I had always been so unhappy. I think probably that same season of life where I was trying to go back into pastoral ministry and couldn't, and was trying to find a new space and ended up in government. That was kind of maybe the start of that experience. I also was very much disorienting from my family of origins belief system to a new belief system. And so there was a whole, I was not doing the job that I always thought I was going to do. I don't believe the things that I always thought I would believe. And I'm doing work that I never thought I would do. And then at one point, I'm in grad school for something that I'd never thought about before. And then because I was not getting treatment for anxiety, I didn't know I had ADHD. I had all kinds of relationship problems at work. They would blow up and I would not even know that they were a problem. Like in my mind, I was just working and worked really hard. I didn't even know I had a problem with people, but I ticked people off a lot. And looking back, I understand why, but I didn't know that at the time. So it was just all of that together.
Wow. Was the coaching conversation with your friend what triggered your awareness? Because you mentioned that as something that happened, and then you at some point went to urgent care. How is it related?
My anxiety was at peak point at that point. I was working at a nonprofit. My job was grant funded. I had 12 more months of salary. I had not been able to raise any more money. We hadn't gotten any more grants. I had no idea if I was going to apply for another job, what kind of job I could apply for. And I was just in this constant spiraling state. And I think in sharing some of that, the executive coach, it's more of a career coach sort of connection at that point, but trying to ask where I wanted to go and things. One of the things he mentioned was you can't make decisions out of anxiety. So that made me realize that I couldn't make a decision with where I was at, but I didn't know how to fix it yet. Even though I worked at the mental health center for several years, I still was hesitant to go and get help. I don't know what it was exactly. I think that on the therapy side, I was worried about airing all to a stranger. And here I am telling my whole story to your whole podcast audience. And then I think there's some space in some faith traditions where medication for mental health, medication's only for you if you're really bad. And I just always kept telling myself, I'm not really bad. It's a little bit, and I'll be able to figure it out. And I'd lived with it for so long and managed it. I still was getting raises and promotion at work, even though I was ticking people off, that I was surviving, but it just kept getting worse because I wasn't treated. And so he shared some reflections back to me in what I was saying. He shared some experiences from his own life that he had previously and that resonated with me. And so then on that birthday that I was just mad and mean to everybody the whole day, that was the last straw. I knew that something's wrong. So.
Okay. So how has that changed then? So you got medication. You've been working on yourself now for a couple of years. You started your businesses.
Yeah.
How are things going now?
So definitely still work in progress since that. So that was fall of 23. Just January of this year, I accepted, again, my wife had told me this for years, but I finally accepted for myself and went to the doctor for ADHD diagnosis, medication for ADHD. Last year, I started recognizing it, and I worked with specifically an ADHD coach because I wanted to try and manage it without medication. I was really afraid that if I took medication for my ADHD, my brain wouldn't work anymore.
Yeah.
And which sounds funny when I say it out loud, but it's totally true. In entrepreneurship, there's lots of different studies out there, but there's a lot higher percentage of individuals with ADHD among entrepreneurs than the general public. Just having ADHD, the way you interpret and interact with the world, makes entrepreneurship often a better fit. You tend to be more optimistic. You tend to be more futuristic. You tend to be a little bit more analytical about things. You tend to be less bothered by risk, all these things that can make you a good entrepreneur. So at this point, I was terrified that all of a sudden I was going to get medicated for my ADHD and then I was going to fail at business because my ADHD was my superpower, essentially, to be an entrepreneur. That didn't happen at all. Like, I can't tell just in the day to day that I'm thinking any differently than before I got on medication. But my executive brain functioning is significantly higher. I see it play out much more regularly in household, but then also in the workspace. So that's going well. I really am a strong advocate that if you're going to be a good business leader, you have to be healthy. And I don't mean physically healthy. I should be much more physically healthy. I've been doing a lot of work in the emotional and mental health areas for myself, but the health of a leader really impacts the way an entire organization works and the way you interact with your leaders, the trust in you, how you and your business can be resilient in difficult times. So I don't mind, obviously, talking out loud about these experiences because I know that they're much more prevalent than what people think, and people don't like talking about them. But I don't really care. Like, that this is just my story, and I got help and doing great. I'm super happy with my life and still working on myself.
That's awesome. You've been on the ADHD medication just for a few months now.
Yeah.
I mean, I totally get the worry about your brain changing, right? Like, that makes a ton of sense to me. What have you noticed? You said your executive functions improved. Like, what have you noticed as far as your relationships with others and how you feel on a day-to-day basis?
My day-to-day feeling, I don't know that has shifted significantly. I think that I tend to notice more things. And what I mean is, part of my ADHD tends to be hyperfixation on work. Like, I'm just thinking about my businesses all the time. And so I could literally walk past a basket full of laundry that needed to be folded for 2 weeks and not even think once about folding it because I just didn't notice it. It just wasn't there. And now I see that right away, or at least on day 2 or day 3 instead of day 14, and self-initiate more of that type of work. Tasks like that were really hard for me to do at work and at home. Like, little things that needed to be done were probably important, but weren't what I liked to do or what I thought about to give me any energy or endorphins. I would always just put it off. So now I at least have the mental capacity or capability to recognize that fact. So I still don't get excited about folding laundry, and I know it needs to get done, so I can fold laundry. I will also say that I didn't stop managing my ADHD when I got on medication. So I have other things in place, systems in place that really help me. I have an administrative director at Blazer Strategies, Jess. She manages my calendar for me and my inboxes. I'm the kind of person that leaves every single email always in my inbox without deleting anything. And so I think when she started, I had 42,000 unread messages in one of my email accounts or something. I know that hurts some of you. I mean, she helps me with that. Anything that's in both my businesses, anything that's more of like bookkeeping, paying bills, I should never be in charge of paying bills because they will go in a pile somewhere on a desk and I'll never think about it. So being on medication doesn't change those things. I still need help in the areas that I made strong. And what that allows me to do is spend a lot more time and energy in the areas that I am strong. And that's better for all the individuals involved and for the organizations. If everybody can spend more time doing what they do best, everybody's better off.
Yeah, absolutely. I love it. That's amazing. I love all the different tips that you just provided. I think that's going to be super helpful for other people that are listening. Tell me a little about your businesses that you're running and how have things changed for you in your like financial life and your like just experience of life emotionally since leaving the government and nonprofit space and doing your own businesses?
Sure. So right now, I'm sitting in Groundhouse Coffee. It's the mainstay in Gardner. So if you look up Gardner, Kansas on Wikipedia, a picture of Groundhouse Coffee is what comes up to describe the town. So it's just really been the heart of the community. It's been here since 2011. This was, of my 3 businesses, the one that I purchased. And so it was established. When I bought it, we had 2 locations and about 55 employees. The 2 locations, one of them has a full commercial bakery in the back. And we actually just announced last month, we're closing our 2nd location. And I can get really in depth to that if we want to get nerdy about business strategy, but there was a drive-through only. We were getting surrounded by national chains. In order for us to compete with them, we had to cut our staff in half and make it a not fun place to work. Allison, my wife, and I didn't want to own a business like that. So we decided to close it and do what we do best, which is the community connections. So we make all of our pastries and bakery in-house. I get now calls from commercial brokers, business brokers who want to help me expand. They just keep calling. We'll see what happens. But for right now, we're really just leaning into the good that Groundhouse already is in the community. I am not the daily operator here. I have a management team. So there are 3 managers here. One, Jen, is my operations manager. She really does all the day-to-day things. And that allows me to do what I do best, which is the community connections, the overarching business strategy, the vision casting and things in the future. And they take care of all the day-to-day. So I'll still get the most complex personnel issues or things around contracts and things like that. But day to day, people ask me questions. I usually have to say, go ask Jen. And that's the way I like it. It works for both of us. Then I have Blazer Strategies. Blazer Strategies came as a necessary part of my life because I knew that I was going to buy Groundhouse. I had no background in the food and beverage industry, and the business couldn't afford a full-time salary for me if I also had to hire and employ a full-time manager who could do the day-to-day. So I knew I needed supplemental income. At that time, I was the executive director of the Missouri Center for Employee Ownership. So we were a Kauffman Foundation funded nonprofit working with business owners on ESOPs and worker cooperatives as exit strategies for them, as opposed to closing their businesses in small rural communities. And that was that grant-funded job that I was mentioning earlier. So I knew that job was going to end the day before I closed on Groundhouse, and I needed some additional income. I knew from my executive coaching time that I didn't know what I wanted to do, and I couldn't make that decision out of anxiety. At that point, I knew about the relational challenges that I had previously. I had tried starting my own consulting business like a decade earlier, learned some pitfalls. And so that's where Blazer Strategies then kind of launched out as a natural necessity. I thought I was giving myself 10 months to build up this business to supplement my income with the coffee shop. Within 10 weeks, I had to resign from the nonprofit and do Blazer Strategies full time. So it's gone really well. So we're a business development firm. We have a unique business model, which is what allowed us to grow so fast. So I'm actually the only person who is on payroll at Blazer Strategies, but we have about 30 people that work with us. Because I had previously tried to be a freelancer and knew it was really hard to both find clients and do work simultaneously, I knew that other freelancers were having the same issue. So I went out and created some great freelancers that I knew from my previous work life and created this roster of professionals who could do work. Then I would go out and do the sales side of things. And so I'd find a client, figure out what their needs were. Essentially, we do marketing communications and organizational development. We started off as a political campaign consultancy too. That's a whole story in itself, but we closed that down. It just wasn't profitable for us. So I go out, find organizations. We typically serve small and medium-sized businesses and nonprofits, find out their needs, and then I go back to my roster and put together a custom team based specifically on that budget and scope of work. We've done great. In our first full calendar year, we did about $250,000. And this year we'll do around that same, but it's changed from year to year. We used to do a lot of short-term projects. Now we're on a lot more ongoing retainers. And so it's been fun. We've had a couple of international clients. Half of our clients are in the Kansas City metro. And then my newest venture is Mythic Hire. And this could go down a whole nother pathway, but we're trying to build an applicant tracking system that doesn't use resumes at all, because people have learned that AI is used to read resumes and then evaluate those based on job descriptions. So then they use AI to write their resumes to fit the job description. And so the whole thing is broken. Like, people are getting hundreds of resumes for one position. You can't tell which ones are written by the people versus a bot. And then depending on what program that they used, the formatting might be different. So if you do your resume on Canva, typically AI can't read Canva resumes. So you'll just get thrown out even if you're the best candidate. So we're building something that instead a candidate will categorize their work experience based on relevant or unrelated, do the same with their volunteer experience, and do the same with their education. And then our platform will weight those scores and give everybody immediate ranking. And the hiring manager will get real-time ranked candidates based on their experience, except for this platform can actually recognize transferable skills from other career paths, and it can recognize and count time as a stay-at-home parent or caregiver as still having value to a person's life as life experience. We just finished developing the minimum viable product at the beginning of June. Still a little bit work in progress. It has gone a little slower than anticipated due to my housing issues that I said at the top of the podcast. I had to make that my number one focus, but we are on track to roll some type of paid version out by the end of this year. And it's been really interesting. We've had some actually quite a bit of interest from chambers of commerce so far as providing
Nice.
to their member businesses as a benefit. So yeah, those are the three businesses.
That's fantastic. I know you were raising funding for Mythic Hire.
Yeah.
Are
So
you still working on that?
yes and no. So we have been trying to raise money. In part, I'm always a sprint and iterate person. Literally, I had the idea in March, and by April we were trying to raise money. We went from idea to fundraising in like less than 30 days. That was way too fast. We weren't ready to really seek out funding. So we do have one investor who's really interested in investing in us. I talk about this in my newsletter, so this part's public. They require a second investor to come alongside them on the same terms in order for them to invest. We haven't found that second investor yet. So we're still in conversations to figure out what the next step is, whether that's try and lean into something else on the investor side, or if that is stepping back and making it a little bit slower, organic growth, and eventually do a seed round in the future.
So you had a stable situation. How are you doing now? You can address that however you want.
Yeah. The first thing I'll say is I never in my life want to bootstrap another business without some income on the side. Last year, the first full year, I said we did $250,000 at Blazer Strategies. That's top line revenue. I brought home significantly less than that. So right now, that business is in a good place, but my credit card is completely maxed out. And because I had to do that last year to get by. So it was kind of this dream situation. So first of all, I get a lot of questions about how I bought a business and then started a business at the same time. One of my friends said, "It looks like you just won the jackpot." I did, but not in the way that people think. So a good part of the acquisition is seller financed. I love seller financing and could talk a lot about that. And I have some plans to continue to make acquisitions based on that. And then with Blazer Strategies, I had a good friend that essentially gave me my first shot with a client. And your first client's always the hardest one to get. But once you get one, it's a lot easier to get a second and third. And so Courtney Tripp over at Grundfos, they're a global pump manufacturer based in Denmark with 20,000 employees, way bigger than I should have ever been working with. But that gave me my first start. And then it just really blew up from there. So financially now we're almost out of the weeds. I think that by the end of this year, we're going to be feeling pretty good. The coffee shop as a whole, I mentioned that it couldn't afford to keep me a full-time salary and a manager. It's actually been more challenging than anticipated there. So there's always this cash flow constraint and it's not easy. I mean, we're in a good place. We're moving in a positive direction. It definitely took a good 15 months to even say that. But at one point I was working 3 full-time jobs, and anytime you say that in front of my wife, she just shakes her head no. So it definitely was a ride. You have to believe in what you're doing and be committed to that. Now I have great pathway forward, like from here. And even though cash flow for my family was difficult up to this point, I've now 2 businesses that have some value, like there's investing in your retirement at that point. And so it's a lot like owning a house. Once you own a house, you can start building equity. And as long as you manage it well, you can put that value in other places moving forward. So Mythic Hire is not there yet. It's doesn't have a lot of value besides the idea and the test. But the other 2, they have value. So even though my cash flow isn't great right now, I have value in a monetary way that I could leverage if I needed to.
Oh, awesome. I love that perspective. It's unique. I mean, I'm much more on the real estate side than your experience with the businesses. So I love that you use that as a comparison too. It makes it like tangible. Okay. So what advice would you give to somebody that's wanting to start out either in entrepreneurship or really trying to figure out what's next for them? And they know they don't want to continue doing either the corporate life or just like working for someone else. They want to do something different. What would you tell them?
Oh, that's a hard question because everybody's stories is just so different. And I remember I started thinking about making the leap back in 2017, and I would listen to one podcast or YouTube video that would say, "Yes, do it." And then I would listen to another one or read another book that say, "Never quit your job until you have enough money on this other thing to pay your bills." And both of those could be good advice, but there's just so many variables in life and people have different priorities about what they need. I definitely think that individuals who don't have significant debt and who don't have a family or a larger family, there's more opportunity for risk. They need less to be able to make it and succeed from a financial standpoint if they have managed their finances well to that point. But once you have a family, it gets a little scary. So the one place that I would say start is to understand what your risk tolerance is from the get-go. What's the line? At one point, I was looking to borrow some some funds to purchase some real estate. And they said, yeah, no problem. We could just leverage your house and you have a lot of equity in your house and you could get this and you could buy this real estate. Real estate was really valuable, but that was my line. I was never going to put where my family lived at risk for a business. It's not even on the table. Somebody just recommended it to me again yesterday. It's like, no, that like not on the table. So that's my line. The other thing that I'll say is no matter what business you're thinking about going into, and this is specifically for entrepreneurs, whatever you start, the sales cycle always takes way longer than you anticipate. I think you should probably plan on 3 to 5 times longer than you think it's going to take to get a signed contract or a client. That's how long. And so we made a lot of cash projections based on getting clients on a much shorter sales cycle. I even brought on staff with the anticipation of being able to pay them full-time in short order. Ended up losing these great, amazing employees because they had to make full-time salaries for their own needs. And so I couldn't provide for them quickly enough. So that's one of the biggest mistakes I made was assuming the sales cycle would be shorter, we would grow faster, and we could pay for staff. I hired people way too early. That's my starting place.
That's fantastic. Do you have a plan or ultimate vision for what you want your life to look like?
I'm just in the middle of forming it. Another piece of advice, I'll go back to that. I've recently started working with the local small business development center. And so I go every 2 weeks to meet with this consultant. If you're not familiar with these programs, they're no cost. They're funded by the Small Business Administration, a mixture of federal and state tax dollars. You have expert people that have experience in your industry or entrepreneurship doing it. So that's been great. I tell my wife it's like therapy for business. I always go and I love it. He's been asking me questions kind of along those lines. And a long time ago, I gave up the whole idea of creating a 5-year career path. I have not done that in probably 15 years because there's never been a point in my life where 5 years prior or even 2 years prior, I knew I was be here today. Ever. But I am starting to paint a picture of the person I want to be less than a plan or a calendar. So I've already started down this realm, but I would love to have a portfolio of small businesses that can grow in this way. I love the strategy. I love the deals on making acquisitions and reviewing contracts and all of the negotiation part. But I very much intentionally want to build in Gardner. Gardner, Kansas is one of the top 2 fastest growing towns in Kansas. And I think within 30 years, we grew from 3,000 to 26,000, which I know is not, it's 23,000 increase, but percentage wise, totally changes the landscape of town. At different times in my career, before I became an entrepreneur, I wanted to work in Gardner and I would look for jobs and I could never find a job that paid enough for me to work here. And so if you wanted to find a job in town that pays more than $50,000 or $60,000, you maybe can count them on your fingers, the number of positions even open. But when we moved here 10 years ago, and now we're sold our house for almost twice as much as what we bought it for in 10 years. So salaries have stayed pretty much at exactly the same place they had been. Housing prices have doubled.
Wow.
Huge gap there. So I would love to continue to develop businesses that are people focused in the way they treat people, compensate people fairly, and then eventually bring some higher paying jobs to the community to help close that gap between incomes and housing prices. We're very much a commuter town right now because people can't get a job in town and afford to buy a house here. It requires them to leave, which then hurts local businesses because half the town is not here during the business day. So there's a lot of things there. So I really am looking towards being an entrepreneur, a serial entrepreneur in this way, specifically building in Gardner.
That's wonderful. I love that you're so rooted in place as part of your vision. I would say pretty unique, at least as far as the conversations I've had. I think it's awesome. If you had to choose between happiness or success, which would you choose, and has your answer changed over time?
I wanted to cheat and say, what if happiness is how I define success? And it would be both. So one of the things I've been thinking about, again, going back to this SBDC consultant, he has a PhD in business strategy. And so he always brings all these theories to the table, which I love. I'm a recovering academic and so on. But he talks about entrepreneurs tend to be somewhere on the spectrum between whether they want to be rich or king, and whether they're driven by building a lot of wealth or wanting to be in charge. And so that's been an interesting spectrum because at first, like the way I grew up, both of those things were seen as bad, like having ambition or wanting money would be like evil, sinful things. And so like it was kind of hard to want to put myself on that spectrum. But I have found that I'm very much more driven on, if I had to be on that king side, like I really like being in charge, but in order to have power to empower other people, the wealth or riches, if that's how we want to define success. The only thing that drives me in that category is having enough to take care of my family and to provide for them. 4 kids, they're all going to have to go to college eventually. There's a lot of expenses there. So like that's like on the money side, I just want enough that takes care of them. And then any other money that I'd have, I wouldn't be hoarding it. It'd be investing it in other people and in the community, trying to build and increase the economic development. So that is success and happiness. But if I had to choose, I'd have to say happiness. I, for a very long time, was very successful in temporary jobs, or traditional jobs, I should say. I was getting the top bonuses. I was getting promoted on a pretty quick basis. I was getting the maximum raise every year based on performance in different workplaces. So earlier, like that drive in Mesa that I mentioned about, I don't like this. I left it, gave up the best healthcare I probably will ever have in my entire life, which is like been the hardest part about the whole thing. But happiness, when I'm happy, I'm a much better dad and husband when I'm happy in my career. And when I am stressed or anxious or in a bad place with my career, I become not good dad and not good husband. And that's still like the heart of what drives me on the back end. As much as I talk about investing in Gardner, it's like, I want to invest in Gardner after my family's taken care of. Like that's like the central core. So if I had to choose between, to me, that's like, do I want to have the ability to empower lots of other people, or do I want to be a good dad and good husband? I'm going to pick being a good dad and good husband every time.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for putting thought into how you answered that question. I just absolutely love it. What's the most liberating decision you've made since leaving your job that you would have never made before?
I love that I can just very naturally intertwine my professional life and personal life throughout the day and intermingle it. I take my kids to school a few days a week. I pick them up a few days a week. I can go and volunteer in classrooms and go on field trips. Things that when I really wanted to care about getting promoted or a reputation at work or a big project was a lot harder for me to do. So I think it kind of happened naturally with it. But when I shifted to this entrepreneurial world, being okay with taking breaks in the workday to just do what I needed to do for the family has been the most liberating. I always am going to work at least as much as anybody else is, even if it's not all at the same time. So giving myself just permission to break up the day in different ways has definitely been the most liberating.
That's fantastic. Thank you. Is there anything I didn't ask you about that you think I should have?
Not necessarily. I did think here at the end, one of the things with ADHD is that often I verbal process. So when I have words come out of my mouth, it is actually in real time as I'm thinking them. And I don't think them in my head before I say them, which you can imagine can get me in trouble sometimes.
Yeah.
But I think as people listen to this podcast, or if you now go back and listen to what I've already said, you will hear me processing the answer to the question out loud in real time before I can answer it. And I just happen to think of that here at the end to recognize, again, I guess just bringing some attention to the way ADHD functions differently, the way it can be good or bad. It's how I write too. I like being able to describe how I come to a decision. It's just natural, but then also recognizing that sometimes I'm going to say things that aren't thought out at all. Like I literally said it as I thought it. And so it's just a different way to approach conversation or dialogue or storytelling when you literally are processing it for the first time out loud. As I say it, that's the first time I'm hearing the thought. And it's been very hard for some folks to kind of comprehend how to imagine that.
Do you have an internal monologue?
All the time. Yeah. When I'm speaking, that's my internal monologue is speaking. Like there's not a separation there. Or I have to be very mindful and intentional and pausing and thinking before I say something.
Yeah, no, that totally makes sense. I asked the internal monologue question just because I learned in the last year that some people don't have that. So I was wondering if that's true for you, but clearly no. Okay, interesting. Yeah. Very cool. How can people find you or find out more about you?
So I'm very active on LinkedIn. So LinkedIn/IN/Keith M. Davenport is where you can find my direct LinkedIn profile. And then, of course, groundhousecoffee.com, blazerstrategies.com, or mythichire.com.
Wonderful. And then I'll add links. That'll be great.
As I mentioned at the top of the show, Keith has had a massive year of transition since we first sat down to record. On the business front, he stepped away from the CEO role of Mythic Hire and handed over the reins to his co-founder. While he remains the president, this allowed him to launch 030 Holding Company. He's now acquiring small businesses using seller financing to increase their legacy and increase wealth and jobs in his own local community, which, as you heard in the podcast, is super important to Keith. His goal now is to create more jobs, increase wages, and build in profit sharing. In October, they acquired their very first business, a custom apparel company now called Madison Street Threads. He's leveled up his knowledge so much that he's now teaching 2 courses on buying and selling small businesses at the Small Business Development Center at the Johnson County Community College. So in true Keith fashion, continuing to give back. On the political front, Keith won a seat on his local school board, but he had to resign after he moved to a different part of the district. His advocacy hasn't stopped, however. He's actively using his business leadership as a force for good in the community, most recently working with the local police department to develop alternative plans after the city criminalized homelessness. Keith is the ultimate example of finding your way out and constantly evolving to build a life on your own terms. I hope you enjoyed this values-led founder story as much as I did. Until next time, go rewrite the rules.